Hi, I am Dr. Felice Gersh, your integrative OBGYN physician. We're going to talk about something that at some point or other will affect virtually everyone. It's called aging. Now, you may have heard, if you've been watching any media going on, any news broadcast or going to conferences, one of the big buzzy things out there is all about longevity medicine. And there are all these new doctors out there. They're starting longevity clinics and, living to a ripe old age while still holding all of your abilities is quite the thing, right? We all want to have an incredible health span. So health span means you're living with great vitality, the ability to do all the things that you want to do reasonably, okay? So to become what I have labeled a super-ager, which the goal is that somewhere in your 90s, all the way up to almost 100, you can do most everything you could do when you were in your 30s. Maybe you're not going to climb the tallest mountain, you're not going to do skydiving. I don't know that you did any of that in your 30s either. But really live a high quality life without lots of pain and suffering, chronic diseases associated with aging. Well, we're going to talk about what I feel is probably key, and that is the mitochondrial theory of aging. So the first thing is just a little background on what are mitochondria. I'll bet you, like almost everyone, when you were in high school, you learned the mitochondria are the powerhouses of the cells. They create energy, and that is true. But it's even more complex than that. Nothing is as simple as we thought. And it's really critical that mitochondria stay vital and healthy for way up into your 90s, because without healthy mitochondria, you cannot have a healthy body, because energy is the spark of life. You have to have energy. So a little bit more on mitochondria. Mitochondria are in almost every cell. They are very interesting little things. We call them organelles. They're little structures that actually were originally derived from bacteria, from microbes, and they're inherited through the mom. So mitochondria have their own unique mitochondrial DNA, like I said, inherited from the mom. So they're almost like alien trespassers that have taken up residence in you. And that's the part of the most amazing thing of life. Now, if we think about mitochondria, you need to know that not only do they create energy, they control the cell cycle. So the cell cycle means that you have to have some kind of off switch so that cells, when they're old, they're senescent, they're creating inflammation. Sometimes they're called zombie cells because they can also develop misfolded proteins, instability of their DNA, and actually ultimately turn into cancer cells. So they are underlying chronic inflammation, and they also can foretell the development of cancer. That's why they got the name zombie cells. So you may have heard the term inflammaging. Somebody clever came up with that little terminology. It's about aging being accompanied by this low-grade chronic state of inflammation. And inflammation underlies the development of neuroinflammation, which leads to neurological disease like Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and such. It also creates inflammation in your arteries, which gives you vascular disease, inflammation in your bones, and then you have the osteoclasts, the immune cells of the bones gobbling up the bone and giving you osteoporosis, and in the joints you get the osteoarthritis. So you can go organ system by organ system, and they all become low-level inflamed, which leads to chronic states of deterioration and poor function, which means you as an total compilation of these different organ systems will not function optimally, which is obviously not our goal for healthy aging. So understanding that mitochondria create energy for metabolism, It's the mitochondria that burn fats and burn sugar, and they create energy. So where do you have most need for energy? Like your brain, your heart, and your skeletal muscles. So you really want to make sure you maintain vital functional mitochondria. But this does not happen typically with aging. So why is that? What underlies the deterioration of these vital energy producers that also control the cell cycle? So the cell cycle, as I want just make sure you understand, this is where mitochondria are so critical in a way that most people don't have a clue. They tell these old zombie senescent cells, now you die. You kill yourself. We call that programmed self-suicide or apoptosis. Those zombie cells must die, but they will not if you don't have proper functioning mitochondria in terms of eventually they may die, but you may become really harmed by their hanging around too long. They've outstayed their welcome. We got to get rid of them. And mitochondria make that call. So what are the things that cause mitochondria to deteriorate so we don't make proper energy, the spark of life to maintain optimal function of our organs, and tell those zombie cells, you must now die? Well, what can interfere with proper mitochondrial health? Well, foremost is always, in my mind, hormones. Now, for women, it's estradiol. For men, it's testosterone, because it turns out testosterone can be converted locally in tissues to estradiol for use by the mitochondria. So estradiol is critical for mitochondrial function in terms of what's called the electron transport chain, which creates ATP. That's the form of energy that is made by mitochondria. You need to have estradiol. For mitochondria to go into a rejuvenation state called mitophagy, you need to have adequate amounts of estradiol. For having the proper function of the enzyme called manganese superoxide dismutase, you need to have estradiol. Now, the importance of that enzyme, manganese superoxide dismutase, is that a byproduct of creation of energy is a great deal of toxic waste. This is a waste byproduct. So it's important to know that you cannot have mitochondrial functioning without creating this waste product, which is poisonous in itself, called superoxide, two oxygens together. Superoxide will kill, if it stays in the mitochondria too long, it will destroy that mitochondria. But it cannot get out of the mitochondria. It cannot diffuse out. So what happens in a healthy person, a young, healthy, vibrant person? You take this estradiol, whether it's coming from estradiol from your ovaries, or a man makes his testosterone and it's converted to estradiol locally in the neighborhood, and estradiol runs that enzyme system, and that superoxide by that enzyme is converted to hydrogen peroxide, so which is H2O2. Now, hydrogen peroxide is also poison, but the difference between hydrogen peroxide and superoxide is that hydrogen peroxide can diffuse out of the mitochondria into the cell itself, into the cytoplasm, where through other enzyme systems, it's converted to harmless water, H2O. So O2 is converted by this enzyme in the mitochondria to H2O, superoxide, to hydrogen peroxide. So hydrogen peroxide exits the mitochondria into other areas of the cell, where another enzyme is going to convert the H2O2 to harmless H2O water. So the mitochondria is not killing itself with its absolutely unavoidable metabolic waste product of the creation of energy, superoxide. So what happens when you go through menopause and you don't have enough estradiol? You're going to have deterioration of your mitochondria. Now, it actually gets worse than what I just told you, because when mitochondria start to die because their superoxide builds up into them and they stop functioning properly, they actually create even more toxins, including like toxic nitric oxide, but not the good kind of nitric oxide. This is called inducible, which turns into poisonous nitrate-related products that can then poison the whole cell. So the toxic waste turns into even more toxic waste as the mitochondria itself starts to deteriorate and die, creating even more waste, which leaks into the cell as a whole, which then poisons and damages the whole cell. So now you have inflammation. This damage is creating inflammation because when you have dead, damaged cells of the body, the immune cells become activated into a pro-inflammatory state. So now you have this chronic state of inflammation that's being induced by these dying, unhealthy mitochondria, releasing more poisons and damaging and killing the formerly healthy cells. So you see how critically important it is to have an adequate amount of estradiol early on in the perimenopause before you go down and have too much damage to these vitally important mitochondria. But that's not all that can harm our mitochondria. It's foundational to have estradiol. But even if you have adequate estradiol, it doesn't mean you're home free, because we live in an environment filled with toxicants, chemicals like heavy metals like mercury and arsenic. Arsenic is a direct poison to the mitochondria, and so is mercury. Lead, there's so many heavy metals, cadmium, strontium. All of these heavy metals can damage the cells and damage our mitochondria directly. And what about others like persistent organic pollutants? There are many really toxic chemicals that are poisonous to the mitochondria. So we want to do everything in our power to live the cleanest life in terms of exposures to toxic chemicals and waste. But I know there's just so much we can do. Even when we're super careful, we can't control everything. I mentioned arsenic. Every one of my patients, I try to get them all. I can't say everyone, but the majority, I will test heavy metals on. Get this tested in yourself, because arsenic is very common in our water, especially well water. And the reason is that arsenic is part of the pesticide world. You think that pesticides are certain things like called organophosphates? Yes, but it's even more complicated because they incorporated a lot of arsenic into pesticides. The arsenic stays in the ground and it seeps into the well water. So if you're drinking well water, either directly from your own well or coming from the water supply of your community, to have your own well water tested for arsenic, but also talk to your water supplier to find out what's in your water. See if there's arsenic, but also other stuff, because now they're supposed to be testing for some of the forever chemicals, which previously were never tested for, which are really, really harmful, toxic chemicals for our mitochondria. Viruses. So chronic infections and even acute infections will have damage, but chronic infections will have chronic problems to our mitochondria. And a chronic infection can be different herpes viruses. In the cervix, you have like the HPV, human papilloma virus, which can be chronic. You can have chronic hepatitis viruses. So there's a variety, and also COVID. We now know that COVID viruses can be chronic. These can also be mitochondrial toxicants. So, if you are having problems with energy, we know, for example, chronic fatigue syndrome, which is really a problem with mitochondrial energy production, is related in many cases to reactivated Epstein-Barr virus, which is the same virus that causes mononucleosis, known as mono. And we now know that COVID infections, even very mild ones, even ones that are not even recognized as COVID infections, can actually cause reactivation of this virus, because the Epstein-Barr virus is in the herpes family. And herpes viruses never are eradicated from your body. They go into like a dormant stage, hopefully never to be reactivated ever, but they can be. And old age can reactivate them. That's why older people are more prone to reactivated chickenpox, varicella, known as shingles, right? So these chronic viruses, if they're reactivated, can definitely cause chronic fatigue syndrome, which is really a mitochondrial dysfunctional state. So this is important. What about your diet? If you're eating a high intake of ultra-processed food, lots of high fructose, it's not just what you eat, which is like toxic waste and soda, and I hate to call it that, but a lot of the food that people are consuming, it technically doesn't even qualify as food because it has no nutritional value, and that's part of the definition of food, is that it actually has nutritional value. So your people are eating this really terrible for you ultra processed food that comes in packaging with often plastic and all these chemicals that you can't even figure out what the heck are these things. They can be emulsifiers, they can be stabilizers, they can be preservatives, artificial colors and flavors, all kinds of things, none of which are natural. And even when it says natural, it usually is not natural in the sense that it's not naturally there. It's being added and it's really processed something. It's not really natural. So try as hard as you can to avoid factory-produced food. You want farm-produced food as much as possible, and avoidance of things like high fructose corn syrup. And trans fat was a big problem, but even some of the ultra-processed foods, they are not allowed to include trans fat, but some of the fats that are in them from the fats that are used can actually be converted into trans fats. So you really don't want that, and you don't want the processed seed oils. They're really very toxic. They create oxidative stress in your body, which is the opposite of what you want. What about chronic stress? So chronic stress is also another big problem. So when you have a lot of chronic stress, you're going to have abnormally produced amounts of cortisol. It's going to make a mess of your circadian rhythm. You'll probably then have sleep problems, which is another thing I want to make sure you know, that lack of adequate sleep is also going to be bad for your mitochondria. So we don't want to have sleep deficiency states. We don't want to have chronic stress. So that's where mind-body practices and sleep hygiene, which we'll go into in more detail in additional talks, because they each deserve their own special focus, some of which I have covered to some degree. So what can we do about having these problems? Well, one, if you're perimenopause or menopausal, then for sure you want to think about going on hormones and going on physiologic dosing, getting the doses that are reminiscent as much as we can of the levels that you had when you were in your 20s, with the rhythms as well. If you're not feeling well and you're on a hormonal contraceptive and you can afford, and I mean in terms of potential pregnancy, or you have an alternative, because I don't want anyone getting pregnant by accident. That's a really big deal. But if you can avoid using hormonal contraceptives, they are pro-inflammatory. They are not supporting your mitochondria. They do not have estradiol in them, and the ethinyl estradiol that's in the vast majority of them will only a small percentage actually turn into estradiol. So you're getting more estrone, which is another estrogen, and it's not evil, but when you have too much of it, it's bad, okay, because it's more pro-inflammatory. Only estradiol made by your ovaries or given as a hormone replacement therapy actually balances its actions on evenly and appropriately on all the estrogen receptors, so that it turns on and off inflammation appropriately, which is not going to happen if you have any other estrogen product. Now, what about if we talk about some genetic things as well? Well, there are some genes that can actually make you more prone to having mitochondrial problems. One that is probably the most famous is the ApoE gene, or SNP, and that's single nucleotide polymorphism. So when you have ApoE4, and you'll have two, you get one from each parent. So it would never just be 4 by itself. It could be, it comes as a 2, a 3, or a 4. So the worst of all, which is not a lot of people, but it is the worst one, is having 2 4s. Each of your parents gave you a 4. The next worst is having a 3 and a 4. And then the 2 and a 4, which is actually pretty rare, is not as good as having 2 3s or 2 2s, but it's not as bad as having, we think, a 3 and a 4, and certainly not as bad as having 2 4s. So these can increase your risk of oxidative damage to your mitochondria. Now, another thing in the terms of the genes may be methylation. So we can do a test that's very simple, a simple blood test. It's available from all the major laboratories called MTHFR, methyl tetrahydrofolate reductase. No test coming, just MTHFR. Depending on the genes that you get 2 of each type, 1 from each parent. If you have the double T, then you have a reduction in your ability to do this really important metabolic process, like molecular process that is called methylation. And you're down about 70% from what is optimal if you have 2 of the types of variants, that is the C77T. So I call it the TT. So this is an easy blood test. So it just means you're at risk. And often you will have elevated homocysteine, which is an amino acid, and it's important to measure that. So I just want you to know these are things that you can actually measure. So that's important. Now, there are also some drugs and pharmaceutical drugs, and there are also some like illegal drugs like cocaine and methamphetamine that can harm your mitochondria too. And what about some of the legal drugs? Okay, the drugs that are prescribed. Well, Tylenol, the generic is acetaminophen, actually is bad for your mitochondria. So I do not recommend taking too much of the acetaminophen for pain or whatever it is you're taking it for fevers, because it really is harmful to your mitochondria. So you want to do as little as possible. What about the alternative, the NSAIDs, the non-steroidal anti-inflammatories like ibuprofen? They're not good either. I wish that they were, but they're not good either for mitochondria. So it's really a bad idea for older people to be on these drugs chronically because they have osteoarthritis and pain. You know, there are other things that can be utilized. Sometimes even, I love curcumin products. You can use certain derived products from like CBD can be used for chronic pain, which is way better than also opioids. And you can use boswellia, also known as Indian frankincense. So these are things for pain management. I know pain management is a really, really tough one. Statins. Now, you know statins, these are the drugs to lower cholesterol. Well, what you may not know, maybe you do, it's kind of commonly known nowadays, is that they block or to partially block the enzyme that is involved in the liver producing cholesterol. So, 90% of all the cholesterol that circulates in the blood is actually produced in the liver. So the drug family called statins partially downregulates or inactivates this enzyme. Well, it's the enzyme that also creates CoQ10, coenzyme Q10, which is a critical coenzyme for mitochondrial function to create energy, also called ATP, with the electron transport chain. So you're going to have a decrease in your ability to create energy, which, by the way, is why they took some of the largest doses of statins off the market, like the brand name Zocor had, that's simvastatin. It used to have a dosing that was 80 milligrams. That drug isn't even used as much anymore because rovastatin is used so much more, along with, and so is Lipitor, atorvastatin. So here's the thing. The drug Zocor, simvastatin, the 80 milligram dose was taken off the market because it increased heart failure, because that is like you're trying to prevent a heart attack, so you give your patient heart failure, hardly a good trade-off there. So they had to take it off the market. And why would it do that? Because it's facilitating the enzyme that converts into statins, but also into CoQ10. So you're going to have dysfunctional mitochondria. That's why in many cases, especially for primary prevention, in women in particular, the amount of benefit that women get from statins is really, really marginal. And there are so many better ways that we can work with cholesterol, and also recognizing that cholesterol itself is not evil. It's inflammatory processes that affect cholesterol, creating oxidized cholesterol, like rancid cholesterol. So cholesterol is just the target of inflammation, free radicals, oxidative stress. So we want to control oxidative stress by maintaining healthy mitochondria. By maintaining healthy mitochondria, you can prevent a lot of inflammation, because those mitochondria will not disintegrate and go into a bad state and then start creating more inflammation, because they are causing cells to become unhealthy and die prematurely. So that's another very big thing. What else? Well, antibiotics can actually negatively impact mitochondria. The one that has probably the worst effect is ciprofloxacin, also known as Cipro. So sometimes you have to be on antibiotics, but even amoxicillin has negative impact on mitochondria. So what's the rule of thumb? Only take antibiotics when you really need them. Don't take them because you think you might want it, or you think you have something that needs an antibiotic. Be as sure as you can be. Don't treat them lightly, because they're harmful to your mitochondria. Of course, they're not good for your gut microbiome either. So we now know a lot more about antibiotics, benefits and harms. So we treat them very specially, like we don't just throw them at people like once upon a time. That did happen. Now, what about the treatments? Okay, well, some are obvious from what I told you cause the problem. How about if you have a lot of stress? Well, then you want to incorporate mind-body practices. If you don't have hormones, you're perimenopause, you're menopause, you go on physiologic doses of hormones. If you're eating a crappy diet with lots of ultra-processed foods, you want to eat across the colors of the rainbows, because by adding in polyphenols, antioxidants, vitamins, and minerals, you will be dramatically supporting the health of your mitochondria. So eat a ton of plants, all different kinds of plants, and just a small amount of animal protein, and try to get a lot of your protein, the bulk of it, from things like legumes, nuts, seeds. The legumes are like the beans and the lentils and the whole ancient grains like quinoa, which is technically a seed, but I put it in the grain family. So quinoa and millet and amaranth and buckwheat and corn on the cob, particularly white corn on the cob, because that's non-GMO. So eating those will be really great for giving you healthy proteins and help to support your mitochondria. Alcohol. Alcohol is toxic to your mitochondria. Limit or even avoid it altogether. We now know that there's no benefit to actually drinking alcohol. Like red wine, it's from the grapes, not the alcohol. So please try to have as little alcohol in your life as possible, and there is nothing wrong in eliminating it altogether. It is not a health food, okay? It harms so many things. It's directly toxic to your brain, to your gut, to your liver, and it's not good for your mitochondria at all. And what else? There's some specific supplements that can be beneficial. Many of them are antioxidants, like lipoic acid and vitamin E. And certain other B vitamins are really critical for creating energy, for working the different energy pathways that are in the mitochondria. B1, thiamine, B2, riboflavin, B3, niacin, B12, which is cobalamin, and the other B vitamins are really like B5. They're all also very important. So you can take additional individual Bs. You can also take B complex, and if you're not sure, take methylated, because if you don't know your MTHFR status, just be safe and pre-methylate them. That will help you if you do have some, like we'll say, lesser desirable methylation genes, okay? And what about some other phytoestrogens? I told you estrogen is like incredibly critical for mitochondrial function. Well, there's a supplement now that I'm taking and I'm recommending to most everyone now. It is products containing urolithin A. And the two ones that are on the market in the US that have the patented tested formulation is called Mitopure and Renewal. So urolithin A is a derivative coming from like pomegranates, and pomegranates make a phytonutrient called the ellagic acid, and ellagic acid needs to be converted into urolithin A. But that happens in the gut, and most of us don't have that ability, and most of us aren't eating a ton of pomegranates anyway. So you can take it as a supplement, and go Google it if you like, urolithin A and mitochondria. It's a mitochondria rejuvenator because it is a phytoestrogen. Like, it's amazing. You know, as soon as it came out on the market, I saw the study, I said, I'll bet you it's a phytoestrogen. Yes, it is. It's a phytoestrogen. And it works predominantly on the alpha receptor. Most of the phytoestrogens that we eat, like from soy, they're actually, and a lot of the other ones, they're actually activated, they activate the beta receptor. So urolithin A activates predominantly the alpha receptor, and it works on the mitochondria to rejuvenate them. So it looks like snake oil, because why did it look like snake oil? Because where are the mitochondria? Like everywhere. So if you rejuvenate mitochondria, just like if you give bioidentical estradiol, you're going to have benefits in every organ system, whether it's a neurological system involving the brain, or it's bone, or it's pain, the immune system, or muscle, where much of the research is on muscle. So I definitely say, you should really seriously consider this. And CoQ10. Now, CoQ10 is very poorly absorbed, so I usually recommend the absorbable form, which is ubiquinol. Okay, and then what about other minerals? It's really important that you incorporate for mitochondrial function magnesium, manganese, and iron. Those are critically important for mitochondrial health and function. And then NAC, N-acetylcysteine, is also really beneficial. It's a precursor as well for glutathione, which you can also take separately if you really feel that you have degenerating poor quality mitochondria, and acetyl L-carnitine, which helps with the shunting of long-chain fatty acids through the carnitine transport system into the mitochondria. So you actually have the fat to burn. You have to transport it across the membrane of the mitochondria into the mitochondria for use as an energy substrate. So that is a lot, I know, but you really, I hope, get the point that mitochondria are essential to healthy longevity. They create energy, which is the spark of life. You cannot have functioning brains and bone and hearts and you name it if you have no energy. So you need to have energy to run all the machinery of the cell. And it controls the cell cycle. It tells the yucky old senescent zombie cells, please now die, so that they don't sit around creating chronic levels of inflammation and potentially turn into cancer cells. So mitochondria are not optional for health. Estradiol is foundational. Add in all the other lifestyle measures, and hopefully you can have the greatest possible health span. Thanks.